Hey everyone, my name is Alyssa. Today I want to share a review with you about a book that I recently read, The Bass Rock by Evie Wyld. This is a story that at its core is about women suffering abuse for refusing to conform to patriarchal standards, and that sounds really brutal, but the author navigates these themes with a lot of complexity and elegance. So certainly for the book, as well as the things I'll talk about in this video, trigger warnings for sexual violence and physical violence of several kinds, as well as like psychological violence really, or manipulation, I suppose would be a better way to say that. So please be warned of that. Now let's dive right in. The story follows three main women spanning three different time periods. Viv, who lives in our contemporary world, Ruth, who lives in the 1940s, and then Sarah, who lives in the 1700s. And these stories are interconnected, but that's an important part of this book because the author plays with the interconnectedness of these stories to use foreshadowing and shifting narrative perspective to play with the dynamics, not only of the content of these stories, but the way that they interact with each other. In the present day, Vivian is a 40-something sort of aimlessly making her way through life woman who goes up to Scotland to care for a family house that is being prepared to be sold. And in the 1940s, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Ruth is recently married and she is her husband's second wife, and she's settling into her new role as a wife and stepmother, and as well as caring for this new home that she's moved to in Scotland with her new family. And Sarah in the 1700s is a young teenager who is saved from a very violent scene after she is accused of being a witch. This book has a lot of feminist themes, but at its center is very much about ways that women are suppressed through violent means by men. And much of this takes place because of various ways that these women push against patriarchal standards or gender rules that are enforced on them or expected of them by the men in their lives. In addition to the main narrative, there are several vignettes of nameless women suffering physical and sexual violence at the hands of men, and at first I thought this was taking the sexual violence commentary too far because it starts to feel really heavy-handed and just excessive. However, I do appreciate the anonymity of these vignettes as they speak for all of the women throughout history that have suffered physical and sexual violence and have never received justice throughout history and still remain nameless and faceless. And while I will still say there's definitely an excessive amount of sexual violence in this book, I think that the author's ambition is to draw attention to the fact that this is still such a pervasive issue in our society, and it truly is, because most of the sexual and physical violence that women face is in domestic scenes. It's not reported as much as it should, and it's not something that we see in the focal sphere of our media or in our day-to-day lives. So I think that the author's intention is really to bring that to the forefront of the conversation and to force the reader to confront and acknowledge that. One of my favorite parts, and one of the things that I think was this book's greatest strength, was the way that the author utilizes these three parallel narratives to reinforce and add complexity to the book's themes. So the narrative spans three different time periods, and the women all experience similar forms of aggression, but that are relevant to their time periods. And the author uses foreshadowing and shifting narrative perspective to add complexity to her themes and diversity in her representation. And the way that these women's experiences parallel each other are not just in the broad themes of patriarchal suppression, but also more similarly in specific experiences. For example, one instance in the book, and this is a mild spoiler about one element of the book. It doesn't spoil anything big, but just so you're warned, and also trigger warning here as well. In the present day, Vivian, after having sex with a man, she tells him that she doesn't enjoy being tickled, and he then tickles her, and she is really upset by this, and he gets mad at her for not enjoying it and very much gaslights her about the situation. But in the 1940s, Ruth participates in a community picnic where the women all wear masks and they hide, and the men find them and tickle them until they tell them their name. And Ruth does not like this. She didn't really entirely understand the game, so it's very upsetting for her. But again, everyone kind of gaslights her and tells her like it's just a game, it's not a big deal. But this tradition, this game that they were playing, is a gamified version of witch tickling. But witch tickling is what happens to Sarah in the 1700s when she is nearly raped to death by the men in her community for being suspected of being a witch. So the author uses variations of this experience in a repetitive form to weave together these individual experiences into a cohesive and unified voice, as well as to illustrate an evolutionary form to physical and sexual violence. And I find this point really important because sometimes women are told that they're overreacting to behavior that could be considered neutral or mild from men, but this happens when that behavior is being taken at face value and decontextualized from any personal or culturally historical or gender specific trauma that action could be triggering. So while Viv being tickled by her partner is a rude violation of her personal autonomy and not at all okay, it's not illegal or like really, really significantly problematic. But the other two instances of physical autonomy being violated are increasingly alarming and then horrifyingly evil. So even mild violations of physical autonomy can be traumatic triggers inside of the context of women knowing that their gender have a history of severe violations of physical autonomy. So hopefully that's not groundbreaking for anyone. We're all on the same page of respecting people's physical autonomy. But what the author does really well is that we begin with these three parallel stories, beginning in the 1700s with Sarah and then Ruth, and then we get the contemporary story of Vivian. So when we read this story about Vivian and her telling her partner she doesn't like being tickled, and then him tickling her, we feel that real violation because it's contextualized within the more serious experiences. And I think the author then demonstrates how that perspective of that experience for Viv is from a female perspective, and the author is able to relate to her perspective of why this would be so upsetting to her in the way that the man may not understand why it's so upsetting for her. I think the author does a really good job of capturing the emotion and the tension and the trauma of that moment for Vivian. And this is just one instance when the author utilizes gaslighting in a really effective way and in an infuriating way as a reader. And I think that that's a really important element in this entire conversation, really about physical and sexual abuse of women. And I think that's important that she doesn't overlook the significance of gaslighting in that entire process of abuse. The author also adds a lot of complexity to these three parallel narratives by using a shifting narrative perspective. So we begin with Vivian in the present day and her story being told in first person, where we get a lot more we get a lot of her thoughts and feelings. It's a lot more intimate. But with Ruth in the 1940s, the story is told in the second person. So we're told her story, but we are removed from her just a bit. We get a lot less of her emotions or fully understanding her thoughts in the same way we do with Vivian. And that juxtaposition makes Ruth feel much more distant from us. But even more distant is Sarah in the 1700s, and her story is told to us in the third person from the perspective of a man who is with her throughout the story. And I think that's really significant because Sarah feels so much more distant than Vivian or Ruth, and you don't there's still a lot of questions as to understanding some of her behavior or some of the things we do that because you are distant from her, you can't understand. And she does not have a voice to tell her own story to us. And so she remains a very distant character. The author's choice of contrasting narrative perspective throughout the novel demonstrates a societal evolution towards recognizing women's voices and elevating the stories and experiences of women. And this theme's necessity is reinforced by the fact that all of these women experience various forms of abuse because they are misunderstood. Either because of lack of opportunity to use their own voice, or because when they do, they are dismissed and invalidated. The shift between first, second, and third person can also really help you follow the story if you haven't read it yet. I'm embarrassed to say that it took me a little bit to be able to distinguish between whose story I was reading. The author kind of throws you right in there. So if you recognize which narrative perspective you are reading from, that can help you follow whose story you're reading. Just a little tip if you haven't read the book yet. Definitely one of the things I found most evocative about this novel was the Gothic atmosphere. This book is so atmospheric. It takes place on the Scottish seaside, and everything about this book feels very cold, very rainy and wet. I feel like I could hear the seagulls on the beach and like taste the salt in the air. This book is so like chilly. It also, so much of it happens in this old house, and I could hear the house creaking in the wind and the cold, and like footsteps through this drafty house. It's really, really atmospheric. And all of this atmosphere really enhances the cruelty of the behavior of the men in this book and adds this level of eeriness and creepiness and dread. In addition to the atmosphere, there are other Gothic elements of the book, such as Sarah, who's accused of being a witch, and there are a few characters that have either a history or some sort of proximity to being institutionalized, and there are several characters that seem to be seeing a ghost in this house. So there's very much this Gothic element to the book, and I think this really reinforces the theme of gaslighting that I brought up before, because when you have this supernatural element of potential madness or seeing ghosts or things that aren't there, you have this challenge to the perimeter of reality that makes you question how you are in fact interacting with reality in a physical sense, which is sort of a physical manifestation of the psychological tool and manipulative tool of gaslighting. So I think there's some really interesting symmetry there that the author is making a very sophisticated choice with. At the time I finished the book, I think I did feel that there wasn't enough of the Gothic. I felt like the author hadn't quite committed to it, but I'm not sure I still feel that way. For one thing, I think it could have ended up overshadowing other elements of the book, and it's also completely Gothic to only hint at the supernatural as an explanation for the unexplainable, rather than sort of confronting it and really deliberately incorporating it in a really obvious way. So I think it certainly works. I think it works really, really well as an additional theme to the book. The Bass Rock is a really, really emotionally evocative book. It evoked a lot of emotion in me, especially anger, but I think that the author does navigate this with a lot of sincerity. The author's form and narrative perspective complement the novel's content and themes in a way that is really subtle, but is really very effective. And while I think the author's eagerness to draw the reader's attention to the issue of violence against women can feel excessive or heavy-handed, but I've found that her objectives are clear and her themes are executed with precision and earnest more than excess. Anyone considering reading The Bass Rock should be aware that there are somewhat graphic scenes of sexual and physical violence throughout the book, and it is all around not a cheerful read. But I don't think that should scare you off if you think you can handle it, because the author offers such an evocative narrative with really, really skillful storytelling. If you have any questions or concerns about the book before reading it, you can leave them in the comments and I'll help you out. But if you have read The Bass Rock, I would love to know how you feel about it, how you felt about it. Well, I had a lot of thoughts while reading this book, like clearly manifest in this video and the fact I've made a review on it. I actually did only give the book 3 stars, and I've really struggled to articulate or to pinpoint exactly why that feels like the right rating for me. That feels very intuitive, but like cognitively I think it deserves better. I certainly think it's really an accomplished novel. So if you have thoughts on the book, I would love for you to share them down below. Maybe you can help me collect a few more of my thoughts, decide I guess sort of the emotional reaction that I had to the book as well, and reconcile that with my intellectual reaction here. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course, and I'll see you all in another video. Bye!